Dune is a fantasy book, not sci-fi. I'm sick of dragons. Bring in some new monsters. Magic systems are less important than characters. That is why Sando is only just okay. Oh, there's quite a lot in that
There's
one.
two things in here, though.
Yeah, there's two in that one. Unpopular Opinions. You guys seem to love these episodes, and today I'm honored to have fantasy author Jed Hearn, that also has a YouTube channel specializing in giving writing advice to aspiring fantasy authors. How are you doing, Jed?
I'm doing fantastic, Johan. Thanks for having me on here. I'm really excited. It feels like I'm on a game show.
Yeah, well, I'm so excited to have you here. I mean, your channel has been doing amazingly in the past year, and yeah, it's definitely something to look up for. As usual, we have signs that say agree and disagree. So whenever I read an unpopular opinion, we'll show our signs and then we'll have a discussion. Are you ready, Jed?
I'm so ready. I'm scared to see what these opinions are, but I'm pumped.
Dune is a fantasy book, not sci-fi.
Oh, wait, do I put my sign up now?
Yeah,
Yes.
go on.
Hard agree.
Hard agree.
Hard agree. Yeah,
Well, I've only
absolutely.
read the
Wow, I
first
disagree straight off the bat. This is amazing.
Okay, go on.
Okay, so he uses sci-fi, but the actual appeal of the book is the fantasy elements. They're battling with swords. There's so many things around the kind of mystical aspects of the story, with Paul being able to see into the future, and all of the trappings of fantasy are there. I suppose it's kind of in that in-between genre where it's sort of sci-fantasy, but I feel like it is a fantasy book in my mind because it takes such pains to remove so much of the technological aspect of science fiction from it. Curious to get your take on it, though.
So I've only read the first book 3 years ago, and I wouldn't even call myself a massive Dune fan. So I don't have a strong opinion about this. And I do agree with you that it does have the appeals of fantasy, how the planet works and everything. In my mind, just because it's very futuristic, and since it's always been classed as the Lord of the Rings of the sci-fi genre, it's always just been in my head that it is a sci-fi book. Well, maybe I should be somewhere in the middle, because yeah, I don't really have a strong opinion about this one. Magic systems are less important than characters. That is why Sando is only just okay. Oh, there's quite a lot in that
There's
one.
two things in here, though.
Yeah, there's two in that one. Let's take the first one. Magic systems are less important than characters.
Agree.
That's a hard
Yeah.
agree on that one.
100% agree. I mean, you only have to look at writers like Joe Abercrombie, who don't even really have magic systems, to show how little they actually matter in the scheme of writing a great fantasy story. Like, obviously, I love great magic systems. I put them in a ton of my books. I did a video a while back where I had like 100 writers send me their magic system ideas, and I gave the top one like $1,000 or something. But the characters are just so much more important when it comes to the scheme of the story, right? Like, that's what you actually connect to. And like, that for me is the big appeal that's going to keep me thinking about a story after I finish it.
Yeah, and I have read some books, particularly some self-published books that have incredible magic systems, but I haven't really connected with the book at all. Primarily because the characters are maybe not that interesting. Like, I would never pick up a fantasy book only to read about a magic system, but I might pick up a fantasy book only to spend time with characters.
I would slightly disagree with that part. I would say that like a magic system is a great way to get you into the book, but it's probably not the thing that makes you stay there. The thing that makes you stay there is your connection to the characters, seeing their journey and seeing their progression.
But that is why Sando is only just okay. So he's kind of saying that Sando is not good at writing characters, which I have to disagree on. I mean, maybe he's not a Robin Hobb or Ted Williams, but I think Brandon Sanderson has crafted some of the most iconic characters I've come across in the genre. Like Vin, Kaladin, Shallan are all incredible characters, especially Stormlight Archive, but also Mistborn. So yeah, hard disagree on that one.
Yeah, totally agree. Exactly what you just said. Like, so many of my favorite moments in Sanderson's books have nothing to do with the magic system and everything to do with a decision that a character makes or part of their transformation that they go through.
Battles that last too long are boring. Well, obviously anything that lasts too long is not going to be good. But I suppose the question should be rephrased that battles that are long are boring.
Oh, okay. Are we going with the question that's on the screen or the question that you just rephrased it as?
I mean, I feel the question is kind of unfair because obviously we would agree with this one, right? Because if anything that lasts too long is going to be boring. But let's just take the question as it is. As a huge fantasy fan and stuff like that, scenes...
Sorry, wrong one.
Battle scenes are actually some of my least favorite scenes in all of literature. And that comes from a huge fantasy fan. So that's also why the last book in the Wheel of Time, even though I actually love that book, it's a massive, massive battle scene for 800 pages. The only thing I really remember is the beginning and the end.
Yeah.
And I do remember some bits in the middle, but I don't really skim read, but I often almost feel like I want to skim read battle scenes that just go on for ages and ages and ages. I'm much more interested in the politics and the tension behind the conflict. But when the battle usually starts, I'm just like, okay, let's see who wins and get back to the politics.
What makes action interesting is what it does to your characters, right? And putting characters into situations of pressure or forcing them to have to change the way that they interact with the world or signifying some sort of transformation with them. It's not just action for its own sake. And like, this is something that people get wrong all the time when they think about books versus movies. Movies can just have great action for its own sake. Like you can have Tom Cruise just, jumping off some skyscraper, and that's intrinsically interesting. But in a book, because you don't have the visuals and the sound and the music and all that sort of thing, you can't just rely on choreography or like cool flashing lights to make something interesting. It needs to be rooted in how is this action actually progressing the character and forcing them into difficult circumstances and making them have to make tough choices, right?
I'm sick of dragons. I need some new monsters.
I feel very biased here.
I am okay. I'm not sick of dragons, but I do kind of agree that we're definitely in a phase where dragons are all the rage. Whether it comes to romantasy or self-published fantasy or whatever, dragons are all over the place. And I do think that it would be nice to occasionally see some other creatures, but I love dragons. Dragons are probably my favorite fantastical creature in fantasy. So I'm not sure if I'm ever going to get sick of them. But some variation, I think, is just the key, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I literally am doing the proofreading for Kingdom of Dragons right now, which is a book that is entirely about dragons. And
You're kind of happy
so I'm obviously very biased here. Very, very biased here. Like, we launched it on Kickstarter a few months ago. It did really well, which is cool to see. But, like, weirdly, I kind of agreed with this up until maybe 3 years ago when I started outlining this book. Because growing up as a kid, I absolutely love dragons. Then sort of when I became like more of an adult and I started reading more like quote unquote grown up fantasy or whatever, I kind of got into this attitude of like, oh, like dragons are cliched or whatever. And then I realized like, actually they're not, they're just often used in a cliched way, but there's actually such an interesting dimension that they can offer because they essentially offer, and this is the big thing that I kind of learned through Kingdom of Dragons and what I hope comes across in that book. They offer the ability to have someone who, if your dragon has a kind of psychic connection with your main dragon rider, as is a common trope in these type of stories, they actually offer maybe one of the only bonds in a story that is truly without like filters or without limitations. And in the case of the story I wrote, it's like that dragon is the only person who can ever truly understand the protagonist, right? And so they offer you just this unique bond and this unique kind of dual connection between characters that not many other things can kind of give you. So like, I think that from a sort of character driven level is really, really powerful. And then of course, like the action scenes that you can have with dragons, the potential for what they offer and the menace of what they offer too, if you kind of view them through the lens of making them an antagonist, is really, really interesting as well. But I do agree that like, if they're just done without any interesting twists, or without any kind of like unique approach to them, then like you can run the possibility of them feeling a little bit cliched just because they have been done so much.
Okay, I have an opinion for you.
Okay.
Relating to this one, dragons should not talk.
No. Wait, do you mean like mentally or like actually through their
actually
mouths?
Talk.
Oh yeah, I don't have my dragons actually talk. I kind of agree with you there.
Wheel of Time's characters are fat as a pizza though. Well, I've read the whole series, but do you want to go first on this one?
Okay, so I've obviously only read book one. I just couldn't connect to the characters in the first book. And, a lot of people tell me like, oh, it gets better later until it gets to book 7, 8, and 9, and then you want to kill yourself because it sucks so much, but you have to get through it anyway. And I just didn't find them particularly interesting. I didn't find there to be a lot of complexity or nuance to the characters, I suppose. I think part of this is because I've come to it kind of late in my reading experience. And I feel like if I'd actually read it when I was younger, like one of my best friends absolutely loves the series. He grew up reading it. I feel like if I read it then, I would have had more appreciation for it, but it suffers from the same problem in my mind that the Lord of the Rings series suffers from, which is it came first, it created so many of these interesting ideas, and then so many other people have kind of ripped them off and iterated on them, and I've read a lot of those other people. So when I come back to the original source material, it feels like I've seen all of this before. So for me, like, that's one aspect here. But like, just on the basis of reading book one, like, I couldn't really tell you too many interesting things about it, apart from like, I think Nynaeve tugs her hair a lot when she's stressed or something. That's basically the only detail I took away.
Yeah, I mean, The Wheel of Time is an interesting one. So I always say it's one of my favorite series of all time, which is definitely true. But it's also one of the series where I'm a bit surprised that it's as much loved as it is. Because whenever people criticize The Wheel of Time, like, I agree with most of the criticisms. The characters are so annoying. Jordan's prose is very, very repetitive and overly descriptive. There's pacing issues. Like, I understand all of the criticisms. But I think when you go on such a massive, massive journey with some characters, and then when you look back on it, you just can't help but feel love for those characters. But yeah, they are infuriating. And if you despise annoying characters, then I think The Wheel of Time especially is going to be a series that is going to be very, very hard to get through. Killer first lines in books are overrated and seldom suit the rest of the scene that follows. I kind of agree with this
agree.
one.
Yeah.
Okay, you want to go first?
I genuinely, like, some of the best opening lines out there are just, like, one opening line I think of all the time, and this is from Red Dragon, so not a fantasy book, the first book in the kind of Hannibal Lecter series, literally goes something along the lines of, Will Graham sat Crawford down by the lake and gave him a glass of iced tea. It's like, there's no poetic beauty to that or anything along those lines. It's simply, we're here, two characters are about to talk to each other, and they're maybe in some kind of hot setting that has like iced tea. And then it gets straight into them discussing this serial killer that they're trying to solve. And it's a brilliant opening line because it just gets you into the story and it gets things moving. And like, yeah, there's definitely a time and place for an amazing opening line. You think about the opening to 1984. It was a bright, cold day in August and the clocks were striking 13. I might have got the month wrong there. Immediately kind of establishes something cool. But yeah, and I read like a ton of opening first lines when people apply to like work in my coaching programs and to have me edit their books and stuff. And a lot of the times it does feel like writers try sometimes a little bit too hard with this. And you put all this effort into an amazing first line, and then you kind of just like flub the rest of the scene and it's something boring, like a character just waking up, or there's no real conflict, or there's nothing interesting that they're doing. Yeah, I totally agree with this idea.
I mean, I do also agree on this one. I never really understood the trend where booktubers will read the first line in a book and rate it, because I'm like, it tells you so little about the whole book and story. Albeit there are some iconic, I think it probably comes from, for example, The Hobbit. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Like, people know that line so well because it's so iconic and it sets the tone. And one of my favorite series, The Dark Tower, has this line: "The man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed." And if you have read the series, especially the whole series, that line just stays with you and kind of like blows your mind as you finish the series. So it probably just comes from some series or books having such incredible lines. But I think if it doesn't suit the rest of the scene that follows, then it's better to have a different opening line.
I think the big thing with an opening line, and this goes for your opening few pages as well, is my personal favorite approach is to see that as a microcosm of your whole story. And the reason why that Stephen King example works so well is because in that one line, and I haven't read the Dark Tower series, but I know roughly what it's about. But in that one line, the man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed. It just like perfectly tells you exactly what the whole story is all about, right? It's like this guy following this dude. It's kind of got this Western aesthetic to it. And it like is almost this tiny short story that sets up everything to come and gives you a promise about what the story is going to be about. And that's what I actually think the best opening lines do, is they just give you a promise about what type of story you're going to read.
Every fantasy story should have at least some magic or magical element that's not explained.
So I'm in the middle.
I'm a bit careful of saying it needs to have or should have, but some of my favorite things in fantasy are often the things that are not explained in detail, because then you can like theorize about how does this work, or who is this character and stuff like that. So I think mystery, at least for me as a reader, I really appreciate some kind of mystery. But I think also hard magic systems are popular for a reason, because it kind of lays the rules and it helps you understand how everything works. So I'm somewhere in the middle.
Me too. I think that I love the sense of the kind of numinous or the mysterious or the unexplained in fantasy books, right? And even in series that are extremely hard with their magic systems, like a lot of Brandon Sanderson stuff or whatever, I think there's always elements of mystery that are left remaining in that. And that is actually like just a really fun experience as a reader. You almost don't want to have all of the loops closed off, because then it means that once you finish a story, there's nothing for you to kind of ponder or theorize about or turn over in your own mind. So I do like stories that have elements that are not explained. I certainly don't think it's a should by any means, but like that's just a cheap way of interpreting the question. Like, I think that it's nice to have things that are not always fully explained, and it's good to leave some things up to the reader's imagination so that they can fill them in their own mind and kind of co-create the story along with the author.
And that's also one reason, so this is not related to a magic system, but fantasy authors and TV shows and stuff love to go back and write a spin-off story about this mysterious character that no one knows anything about. But the reason why we love that character is because he was mysterious, or she was mysterious, and there was so much intrigue. And if you take that intrigue away, usually that destroys the character in some weird way.
Dude, I totally agree. Sometimes like less is more. Just leave it unexplained, leave it mysterious. Don't like explain how because they really hated sand when they were a 9-year-old child, they went on to commit genocide across the universe. Just a random example, not being specific at any character at all.
Booktube has become an echo chamber of 20 to 30 recommendations. Oh, I kind of have to agree with this one. I'm probably in the middle since I'm in the Booktube sphere. But the reason why this is because Booktube, or I mean YouTube, rewards you talking about the books that everyone else is talking about. So even if you want to talk about an unknown book, about, I don't know, some kind of self-published book that you love, if you make a dedicated book review for that book, you might get 200 views or something. You don't get rewarded for talking about the unknown books, unfortunately. So
I think there's a certain point where, if your channel gets to a certain size and you develop a particular sense of, an audience that will just kind of like follow whatever you make, regardless of how well it does within the algorithm. I think there are some creators who they will bring books to my attention that I wouldn't have heard otherwise. Like one that springs to mind is Daniel Green talking about Zamil Akhtar's Gunmetal Gods, and that was sort of before the book became this massive sensation. So I think sometimes it's capable, but you're absolutely right. Like whenever someone's making a YouTube video, like I don't know how much effort you put into it, Johan, but it's probably maybe like 10, 15, 20 hours, whatever it is, between all the thumbnail, the thinking about the ideas, the script, the recording of it, the editing. It takes like a bloody long time to make these things. So if you're making something and it's not going to have as much interest with your audience as talking about Fourth Wing, for example, then you're probably going to make the video about Fourth Wing, which is the tricky part about it.
Yeah, I think also when it comes to being a booktuber, for me it's very important to occasionally talk about books that I'm very passionate about. So I will sometimes make dedicated book reviews, but generally I'll put less effort into that video, like B footage and stuff like that, because I know only the people that are super interested in that video will click on it anyway. But then I'll put more effort into maybe my top 10 favorite fantasy series or whatever. I think it is important to do stuff that you're passionate about, but the unfortunate
100%.
truth is that you probably won't get rewarded as a YouTuber if you only follow what you are totally passionate about.
Yeah, I think it's like, for me, it's sort of the 80-20 ratio here, where it's like 80% of the time, try to be making stuff that's interesting to 80% of your, core audience or whatever. And then 20% of the time you can experiment, you can try new things. And sometimes those new things will actually become something that A, was really interesting for you to make, and B, was surprisingly interesting to other people to watch as well.
What I will say though is that it's probably true that Booktube is an echo chamber of 20 to 30 recommendations, but in 3 months' time, maybe 10 or 15 of those books will have been changed for something else. So it does change quite frequently, I think, in my opinion.
It's funny how that happens, right? It's like, there's books that sort of enter the public consciousness, and then it seems like it's the only thing that people are talking about, and then a few months later, it kind of moves on to something else and something else and so forth.
Yeah. Sanderson's fans have started to be like K-pop fangirls. I got attacked on Reddit for putting Emperor's Soul on B tier. I think that with any large fandom, you're always going to have toxic fans. And that's probably just a result of Sanderson's success. If Robin Hobb was as big as Sanderson, Robin Hobb fans would also be toxic and stuff like that. I don't really think that everyone acts like K-pop fangirls, but you probably notice them more since they're just more often. So I kind of do agree. And I would just encourage you, keep criticizing his books if you don't enjoy them. We need also people to have different opinions.
Absolutely, yeah. Like Sanderson is my favorite author. I would agree with you. I didn't think Emperor's Soul was amazing. I would probably put it B or maybe even C tier as well. Just because someone might be your favorite author doesn't mean you always have to think that what they're doing is like the best thing in the world. And particularly when someone writes like 40, 50 books or whatever the number's up to right now, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to put all of those as like a 10 out of 10. But yeah, it's one of those things, right, where it becomes a core part of your identity because obviously the books speak to you and obviously they are amazing books, right? So when that is attacked, you feel like you are being attacked because you identify with loving this thing, which is like obviously a great thing. But yeah, sometimes it can come out in somewhat unhealthy ways.
Book quality is getting worse as publishers trend/trope chase. Fourth Wing, for example.
This is just hard to assess. Like
It is.
I'm just gonna have to say this, just because like I don't know if I can really accurately assess what the landscape of the entire traditional publishing industry looks like, and yeah, like I don't know. I feel like it's just such a huge thing to be able to assess.
Yeah. What I'll say about this one is that I think this person is probably referring to that publishers are increasingly focusing on non-epic fantasy books and are more focusing on romantasy and stuff like that. And if you are going to your traditional publisher now and just reading their newest releases, you might be disappointed that there's no like Lord of the Rings-esque kind of book. Yes. And that you might perceive that as worse quality because you picked up a fantasy book, but instead you got Smut or a love triangle or something. So in that sense, I kind of agree with you. But if you're looking for some good epic fantasy, the self-published sphere has so much good stuff out there. So there's definitely stuff out there to find.
To add to that, I totally agree. I feel like if you're wanting epic fantasy stuff, like it doesn't feel as if traditional publishing is really delivering that, apart from some of the more established authors like Sanderson and maybe John Gwynne. Perhaps I wouldn't say Abercrombie is necessarily epic fantasy, but he's probably in that kind of similar conversation as well. I do think those genres are maybe a bit more of an uphill battle for publishers to invest in, because most epic fantasy series, you might be looking at 5, 7, even 10 books. And it's sometimes difficult to capture them in a very pithy logline that you can give to someone. Like, for example, like, again, I haven't read the book, so I can't make a value judgment on it, but to describe Fourth Wing as like, oh, it's a book about like horny dragons and it's this romantasy thing or whatever. Like, it's something that can easily be communicated on TikTok or Booktube, or it's just easy to kind of spread into the culture. Whereas describing something like the Stormlight Archive to someone, how do you even do that? You're like, oh, there's like
in 10 seconds,
a zillion words. Yeah. You're like, there's all these different characters and they're doing all these different things and there's all these different magic systems. And it's not something that has like good packaging. So it relies on actually being an amazing story and the word of mouth obviously spreading from that. So yeah, I do definitely think that within the traditional publishing space, it does seem like whenever I walk into a bookstore, you can very clearly see like, oh, here are all the sort of young adult romantasy books, which, nothing against that necessarily. It's just probably not my super vibe or anything. And then you've got like all the retellings of various myths, like the retelling of Troy from this different perspective, or the retelling of Odysseus from this perspective, or Hercules from this perspective, or whatever. And again, like, I haven't read a lot of those books, so I can't necessarily judge the quality, but it does feel like there are very clear categories or very clear types that probably are quite different to if you were in the traditional publishing space in the 90s or the early 2000s with epic fantasy being such a big thing as it was. Awesome.
Just finished Oathbringer and realized we don't talk how slow it is. Even slower than Dragonbone Chair. I'm not sure if you read that one. But I'm actually 1,000 pages into Oathbringer right now. So I'm nearing the end.
Yeah.
And I'm really enjoying it. So let me state that first. I am enjoying Oathbringer. But I have found it very, very slow. I was actually quite surprised how slow I found it. Now, everyone talks about the Sanderlanche at the end is so incredible, which it almost sounds to me that people forget how slow it is, because this final act is probably that good. Well, for me, I found, especially the first 600 pages, incredibly, incredibly slow. Albeit there are fascinating things that happen.
I don't think slowness is a bad thing. I think if you enjoy spending time with characters, then why would I want to rush through that as a reader? Why wouldn't I want to actually appreciate the time I get to spend with these characters, getting deeper into their minds, seeing them bond? I do think Oathbringer, out of the 4 Stormlight Archive books that's come out so far, is my least favorite in the series, but it's still one of the best books that like I've read, in my opinion. And I think that
Yeah.
it's really nice because after Words of Radiance, which I think is probably maybe my favorite fantasy book of all time, Oathbringer, it could never live up to that for me. Like just wouldn't be possible. But what it does is it just allows you to go a bit deeper and to spend a bit more time bonding with these characters. And yeah, like the ending of it is really good. It's not, I wouldn't say it's on the same level as like the Words of Radiance ending, but it is very satisfying. It has a very good ending to it. So I'd be curious to hear what your perspective is after you complete it. But I actually think that The Way of Kings was slower than Oathbringer for me personally. And like, I was ready to give that book up at some points until I kind of got to the ending of it. And even after the ending of it, I was like, I love Sanderson. He probably wasn't my favorite author at the time. Hadn't read enough of his stuff. I got to the end of it and I was like, oh, I love Sanderson, but I don't know if I can continue with this series after that first book, even though it had a really good ending. But then everyone was like, oh, you got to read Words of Radiance. Read it, became like my favorite fantasy book ever. And then I'm now just Stockholm syndromed into loving the rest of the series, even if some parts of it might feel a bit slow.
I think Way of Kings is slow in the beginning, but probably also depends on the reader. But I often love beginnings, so I didn't really mind that it was slow in the first 400 pages. Excellent. Thank you so much, Jed Hearn. I will add his channel in the links down below. Please go and check it out, especially if you're interested in writing your own fantasy novel. He provides some incredible advice. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Johan. This was an absolute blast. Like, very keen to do more of this in the future. I really, really enjoyed these opinions. They were all very, very interesting to talk about.
Thank you so much for watching to the end of this video. Now, if you want to support what I do here, then I do have a Patreon. Now, a reason why I created a Patreon was to find a new way to reinvest to the channel, because basically since I created my Patreon, I spent around 100% of my earnings to hire an editor to do a couple of videos for me a month. Now, since creating my Patreon, an editor has done more than 20 videos for me on my channel, so it makes a huge difference. Now, if you join my Patreon, you will also get some benefits. For example, you'll get a name in my videos like these guys. You'll also be able to join the exclusive Viking book club where every month we read one book together, and you might be the one to put the book forward. This month we're reading this book, and next month we're reading this book. You also get to vote on my next read, get access to exclusive videos like a wrap-up or even book reviews, and so much more. But this is totally voluntary, but all support is much appreciated.